They can prove Fagin an accessory before the fact and get the trial on Friday. And he'll swing in 6 days from this, by goat. You should have heard the people growl, said Chitling. The officers fought like devils, or they'd have torn him away. He was down once, but they made a ring round him and forced their way along. You should have seen how he looked about them, all muddy and bleeding, and clung to them as if they were his dearest friends. I can see him now, not able to stand upright with the pressing of the mob, and dragging him along amongst them. I can see the people jumping in, one behind another, and snarling with their teeth and making at him. I can see the blood upon his hair and beard, and hear the cries with which the women worked themselves into the centre of the crowd at the street corner, and swore they'd tear his heart out. The horror-stricken witness of this scene pressed his hands upon his ears, and with his eyes closed, got up and paced violently to and fro, like one distracted. While he was thus engaged, and the two men sat by in silence with their eyes fixed upon the floor, a pattering noise was heard upon the stairs, and Sykes's dog bounded into the room. They ran to the window, downstairs and into the street. The dog had jumped in at an open window. He made no attempt to follow them, nor was his master to be seen. "What's the meaning of this?" said Toby when they had returned. "He can't be coming here." I hope not." "If he was coming here, he'd have come with the dog," said Kaggs, stooping down to examine the animal, who lay panting on the floor. "Here, give us some water for him. He's run himself faint." "He's drunk it all up, every drop," said Chitling after watching the dog some time in silence. "Covered with mud, lame, half blind. He must have come a long way." "Where can he have come from?" exclaimed Toby. "He's been to the other kens, of course, and finding them filled with strangers, come on here, where he's been many a time and often. But where can he have come from first? And how comes he here alone without the other?" None of them called the murderer by his old name. He can't have made away with himself. What do you think?" said Chitling. Toby shook his head. "If he had," said Kaggs, "the dog would want to lead us away to where he did it. Now, I think he's got out of the country and left the dog behind. He must have given him the slip somehow, or he wouldn't be so easy." This solution, appearing the most probable one, was adopted as a right. The dog, creeping under a chair, coiled himself up to sleep, without more notice from anybody. It being now dark, the shutter was closed and a candle lighted and placed upon the table. The terrible events of the last 2 days had made a deep impression on all three, increased by the danger and uncertainty of their own position. They drew their chairs closer together, starting at every sound. They spoke little, and that in whispers, and were as silent and awe-stricken as if the remains of the murdered woman lay in the next room. They had sat thus some time when suddenly was heard a hurried knocking at the door below. "Young Bates," said Kaggs, looking angrily round, to check the fear he felt himself. The knocking came again. No, it wasn't he. He never knocked like that. Crackit went to the window, and shaking all over, drew in his head. There was no need to tell them who it was. His pale face was enough. The dog, too, was on the alert in an instant, and ran, whining, to the door. "We must let him in," he said, taking up the candle. "Isn't there any help for it?" asked the other man in a hoarse voice. "None. You must come in." "Don't leave us in the dark," said Kaggs, taking down a candle from the chimney-piece, and lighting it with such a trembling hand that the knocking was twice repeated before he had finished. Crackit went down to the door, and returned followed by a man with the lower part of his face buried in a handkerchief, and another tied over his head under his hat. He drew them slowly off. Blanched face, sunken eyes, hollow cheeks, beard of 3 days' growth, wasted flesh, short, thick breath. It was the very ghost of Sykes. He laid his hand upon a chair which stood in the middle of the room, but shuddering as he was about to drop into it, and seeming to glance over his shoulder, dragged it back close to the wall, as close as it would go, and ground it against it, and sat down. Not a word had been exchanged. He looked from one to another in silence. If an eye were furtively raised and met his, it was instantly averted. When his hollow voice broke silence, they all three started. They seemed never to have heard its tones before. "Now came that dog here?" he asked. "Alone, 3 hours ago. Tonight's paper says that Fagin's took. Is it true or a lie?" "True." They were silent again. "Damn you all," said Sykes, passing his hand across his forehead. "Have you nothing to say to me?" There was an uneasy movement among them, but nobody spoke. "You that keep this house," said Sykes, turning his face to Crackit. "Do you mean to sell me, or let me lie here till this hunt is over?" "You may stop here if you think it's safe," returned the person addressed after some hesitation. Sykes carried his eyes slowly up the wall behind him, rather trying to turn his head than actually doing it, and said, "Is it the body? Is it buried?" They shook their heads. "Why isn't it?" he retorted, with the same glance behind him. "What do they keep such ugly things above ground for? Who's that knocking?" Crackit intimated, by a motion of his hand as he left the room, that there was nothing to fear, and directly came back with Charlie Bates behind him. Sykes sat opposite the door, so that the moment the boy entered the room, he encountered his figure. "Toby," said the boy, falling back, as Sykes turned his eyes towards him, "why didn't you tell me this downstairs?" There had been something so tremendous in the shrinking of the three that the wretched man was willing to propitiate even this lad. Accordingly, he nodded and made as though he would shake hands with him. "Let me go to some other room," said the boy, retreating still farther. "Charlie," said Sykes, stepping forward, Don't you know me?" "Don't come nearer me," answered the boy, still retreating, and looking with horror in his eyes upon the murderer's face. "You monster!" The man stopped halfway, and they looked at each other, but Sykes's eyes sunk gradually to the ground. "Witness you free," cried the boy, shaking his clenched fist, and becoming more and more excited as he spoke. "Witness you free. I'm not afraid of him. If they come in here after him, I'll give him up. I will. I'll tell you out at once. He may kill me for it if he likes, or if he dares. But if I am here, I'll give him up. I'd give him up if he was to be boiled alive. Murderer, help! If there's the pluck of a man among you free, you'll help me. Murderer, help! Down with him!" Pouring out these cries and accompanying them with violent gesticulation, the boy actually threw himself single-handed upon the strong man, and in the intensity of his energy and the suddenness of his surprise, brought him heavily to the ground. The three spectators seemed quite stupefied. They offered no interference, and the boy and man rolled on the ground together, the former heedless of the blows that showered upon him, wrenching his hands tighter and tighter in the garments about the murderer's breast, and never ceasing to call for help with all his might. The contest, however, was too unequal to last long. Sykes had him down, and his knee was on his throat, when Crackit pulled him back with a look of alarm, and pointed to the window. There were lights gleaming below, voices in loud and earnest conversation, the tramp of hurried footsteps, and endless they seemed in number, crossing the nearest wooden bridge. One man on horseback seemed to be among the crowd, for there was the noise of hoofs rattling on the uneven pavement. The gleam of lights increased, the footsteps came more thickly and noisily on. Then came a loud knocking at the door, and then a hoarse murmur from such a multitude of angry voices as would have made the boldest quail. "Help!" shrieked the boy in a voice that rent the air. "He's here! Break down the door!" "In the king's name!" cried the voices without, and the hoarse cry arose again, but louder. "Break down the door!" screamed the boy. "I tell you they'll never open it! Run straight to the room where the light is! Break down the door!" Strokes thick and heavy rattled upon the door and lower window shutters as he ceased to speak, and a loud huzzah burst from the crowd, giving the listener for the first time some adequate idea of its immense extent. "Open the door to some place where I can lock this screeching hell babe," cried Sykes fiercely, running to and fro, and dragging the boy now as easily as if he were an empty sack. "That door, quick!" He flung him in, bolted it, and turned the key. "Is the downstairs door fast?" "Double locked and chained," replied Crackit, who, with the other two men, still remained quite helpless and bewildered. "The panels, are they strong?" "Lined with sheet iron." "And the windows too?" "Yes, and the windows." "Damn you!" cried the desperate ruffian, throwing up the sash and menacing the crowd. "Do your worst! I'll cheat you yet!" Of all the terrific yells that ever fell on mortal ears, none could exceed the cry of the infuriated throng. Some shouted to those who were nearest to set the house on fire. Others roared to the officers to shoot him dead. Among them all, none showed such fury as the man on horseback, who, throwing himself out of the saddle and bursting through the crowd as if he were parting water, cried beneath the window in a voice that rose above all others, "20 guineas to the man who brings a ladder." The nearest voices took up the cry, and hundreds echoed it. Some called for ladders, some for sledgehammers, some ran with torches to and fro as if to seek them, and still came back and roared again. Some spent their breath in impotent curses and execrations, some pressed forward with the ecstasy of madmen, and thus impeded the progress of those below. Some amongst the boldest attempted to climb up by the water-spout and crevices in the wall, and all waved to and fro in the darkness beneath, like a field of corn moved by an angry wind, and joined from time to time in one loud, furious roar. "The tide!" cried the murderer, as he staggered back into the room and shut the faces out. "The tide was in when I came up. Give me a rope, a long rope. They're all in front. I may drop into the folly ditch and clear off that way. Give me a rope, or I shall do 3 more murders and kill myself." The panic-stricken men pointed to where such articles were kept. The murderer, hastily selecting the longest and strongest cord, hurried up to the housetop. All the windows in the rear of the house had been long ago bricked up, except one small trap in the room where the boy was locked, and that was too small even for the passage of his body. But from this aperture he had never ceased to call on those without to guard the back, and thus, when the murderer emerged at last on the housetop, by the door in the roof, a loud shout proclaimed the fact to those in front, who immediately began to pour round, pressing upon each other in an unbroken stream. He planted a board, which he had carried up with him for the purpose, so firmly against the door that it must be a matter of great difficulty to open it from the inside, and creeping over the tiles, looked over the low parapet. The water was out, and the ditch a bed of mud. The crowd had been hushed during these few moments, watching his motions and doubtful of his purpose, but the instant they perceived it and knew it was defeated, they raised a cry of triumphant execration to which all their previous shouting had been whispers. Again and again it rose. Those who were at too great a distance to know its meaning took up the sound. It echoed and re-echoed. It seemed as though the whole city had poured its population out to curse him. On pressed the people from the front, on, in a strong, struggling current of angry faces, and here and there a glaring torch to lighten them up, and to show them out in all their wrath and passion. The houses on the opposite side of the ditch had been entered by the mob. Sashes were thrown up or torn bodily out. There were tiers and tiers of faces at every window, cluster upon cluster of people clinging to every housetop. Each little bridge, and there were 3 in sight, bent beneath the weight of the crowd upon it. Still the current poured on to find some nook or hole from which to vent their shouts, and only for an instant see the wretch. "They have him now," cried a man on the nearest bridge. "Hurrah!" The crowd grew light with uncovered heads, and again the shout uprose. "I will give £50," cried an old gentleman from the same quarter, "to the man who takes him alive. I will remain here till he comes to ask me for it." There was another roar. At this moment the word was passed among the crowd that the door was forced at last, and that he who had first called for the ladder had mounted into the room. The stream abruptly turned as this intelligence ran from mouth to mouth, and the people at the window, seeing those upon the bridges pouring back, quitted their stations and running into the street, joined the concourse that now thronged pell-mell to the spot they had left. Each man crushing and striving with his neighbour, and all panting with impatience to get near the door, and look upon the criminal as the officers brought him out. The cries and shrieks of those who were pressed almost to suffocation, or trampled down and trodden underfoot in the confusion, were dreadful. The narrow ways were completely blocked up, and at this time, between the rush of some to regain the space in the front of the house, and the unavailing struggles of others to extricate themselves from the mass, the immediate attention was distracted from the murderer, although the universal eagerness for his capture was, if possible, increased. The man had shrunk down, thoroughly quelled by the ferocity of the crowd, and the impossibility of escape. But seeing this sudden change with no less rapidity than it had occurred, he sprang upon his feet, determined to make one last effort for his life by dropping into the ditch, and, at the risk of being stifled, endeavouring to creep away in the darkness and confusion. Roused to new strength and energy, and stimulated by the noise within the house which announced that an entrance had really been effected, he set his foot against the stack of chimneys, fastened one end of the rope tightly and firmly round it, and with the other made a strong running noose by the aid of his hands and his teeth almost in a second. He could let himself down by the cord to within a less distance of the ground than his own height, and had his knife ready in his hand to cut it then and drop. At the very instant when he brought the loop over his head, previous to slipping it beneath his armpits, and when the old gentleman before mentioned, who had clung so tight to the railings of the bridge as to resist the force of the crowd, and retain his position, earnestly warned those about him that the man was about to lower himself down, at that very instant the murderer, looking behind him on the roof, threw his arms above his head and uttered a yell of terror. "The eyes again!" he cried in an unearthly screech. Staggering as if struck by lightning, he lost his balance and tumbled over the parapet. The noose was on his neck. It ran up with his weight, tight as a bowstring and swift as the arrow it speeds. He fell for 35 feet. There was a sudden jerk, a terrific convulsion of the limbs, and there he hung, with the open knife clenched in his stiffening hand. The old chimney quivered with the shock, but stood it bravely. The murderer swung lifeless against the wall, and the boy, thrusting aside the dangling body which obscured his view, called to the people to come and take him out for God's sake. A dog, which had lain concealed till now, ran backwards and forwards on the parapet with a dismal howl, and collecting himself for a spring, jumped for the dead man's shoulders. Missing his aim, he fell into the ditch, turning completely over as he went, and striking his head against the stone, dashed out his brains. End of chapter 50. Chapter 51. Affording an explanation of more mysteries than one, and comprehending a proposal of marriage with no word of settlement or pin money. The events narrated in the last chapter were yet but 2 days old when Oliver found himself at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in a travelling carriage rolling fast towards his native town. Mrs. Maylie and Rose and Mrs. Bedwin and the good doctor were with him, and Mr. Brownlow followed in a post-chaise accompanied by one other person whose name had not been mentioned. They had not talked much upon the way, for Oliver was in a flutter of agitation and uncertainty, which deprived him of the power of collecting his thoughts, and almost his speech, and appeared to have scarcely less effect upon his companions, who shared it in at least an equal degree. He and the 2 ladies had been carefully made acquainted by Mr. Brownlow with the nature of the admissions which had been forced from monks, and although they knew the object of their present journey was to complete the work which had been so well begun, still the whole matter was enveloped in enough of doubt and mystery to leave them in endurance of the most intense suspense. The same kind friend had, with Mr. Losburne's assistance, cautiously stopped all channels of communications through which they could receive intelligence of the dreadful occurrences that had so recently taken place. It was quite true, he said, that they must know them before long, but it might be at a better time than the present, and it could not be at a worse. So they travelled on in silence, each busied with reflections on the object which had brought them together, and no one disposed to give utterance to the thoughts which crowded upon all. But if Oliver, under these influences, had remained silent while they journeyed towards his birthplace by a road he had never seen, how the whole current of his recollections ran back to old times, And what a crowd of emotions were wakened up in his breast when they turned into that which he had traversed on foot, a poor, houseless, wandering boy, without a friend to help him or a roof to shelter his head. "See there," cried Oliver, eagerly clasping the hand of Rose and pointing out at the carriage window. "That's the stile I came over. There are the hedges I crept behind, for fear anyone should overtake me and force me back. Yonder is the path across the field, leading to the old house where I was a little child. Oh, Dick, my dear old friend, if I could only see you now." "You will see him soon," replied Rose, gently taking his folded hands between her own. "You shall tell him how happy you are, and how rich you have grown, and that in all your happiness you have none so great as the coming back to make him happy too." Yes, said Oliver. "And we will take him away from here, and have him clothed and taught, and send him to some quiet country place where he may grow strong and well, shall we?" Rose nodded yes, for the boy was smiling through such happy tears that she could not speak. "You will be kind and good to him, for you are to everyone," said Oliver. "It will make you cry, I know, to hear what he can tell. But never mind, it will be all over, and you will smile again. I know that too, to think how changed he is. You did the same with me. He said, 'God bless you' to me when I ran away," cried the boy with a burst of affectionate emotion. "And I will say, 'God bless you' now, and show him how I love him for it." As they approached the town and at length drove through its narrow streets, it became matter of no small difficulty to restrain the boy within reasonable bounds. There was Sowerberry's, the undertaker's, just as it used to be, only smaller and less imposing in appearance than he remembered it. There were the well-known shops and houses, with almost every one of which he had some slight incident connected. There was Gamfield's cart, the very cart he used to have, standing at the old public-house door. There was the workhouse, the dreary prison of his youthful days, with its dismal windows frowning upon the street. There was the same lean porter standing at the gate, at sight of whom Oliver involuntarily shrunk back, and then laughed at himself for being so foolish, then cried, and then laughed again. There were scores of faces at the doors and windows that he knew quite well. There was nearly everything as if he had left it but yesterday, and all his recent life had been but a happy dream. But it was pure, earnest, joyful reality. They drove straight to the door of the chief hotel, which Oliver used to stare up at with awe, and think a mighty palace, but which had somehow fallen off in grandeur and size. And here was Mr. Grimwig all ready to receive them, kissing the young lady and the old one too, when they got out of the coach, as if he were the grandfather of the whole party, all smiles and kindness, and not offering to eat his head, no, not once, not even when he contradicted a very old post-boy about the nearest road to London, and maintained he knew it best, though he had only once come that way, and that time fast asleep. There was dinner prepared, and there were bedrooms ready, and everything was arranged as if by magic. Notwithstanding all this, when the hurry of the first half-hour was over, the same silence and constraint prevailed that had marked their journey down. Mr. Brownlow did not join them at dinner, but remained in a separate room. The two other gentlemen hurried in and out with anxious faces, and during the short intervals when they were present, conversed apart. Once Mrs. Maylie was called away, and after being absent for nearly an hour, returned with eyes swollen and weeping. All these things made Rose and Oliver, who were not in any new secrets, nervous and uncomfortable. They sat wondering in silence, or, if they exchanged a few words, spoke in whispers, as if they were afraid to hear the sound of their own voices. At length, when 9 o'clock had come, and they began to think they were to hear no more that night, Mr. Losberne and Mr. Grimwig entered the room, followed by Mr. Brownlow and a man whom Oliver almost shrieked with surprise to see, for they told him it was his brother, and it was the same man he had met at the market town, and seen looking in with Fagin at the window of his little room. Monks cast a look of hate, which even then he could not dissemble, at the astonished boy, and sat down near the door. Mr. Brownlow, who had papers in his hand, walked to a table near which Rose and Oliver were seated. "This is a painful task," said he, "but these declarations, which have been signed in London before many gentlemen, must be, in substance, repeated here. I would have spared you the degradation, but we must hear them from your own lips before we part, and you know why." "Go on," said the person addressed, turning away his face. "Quick, I have almost done enough, I think. Don't keep me here." "This child," said Mr. Brownlow, drawing Oliver to him, and laying his hand upon his head, "is your half-brother, the illegitimate son of your father, my dear friend Edwin Leeford, by poor young Agnes Fleming, who died in giving him birth." "Yes," said Monks, scowling at the trembling boy, the beating of whose heart he might have heard. "That is the bastard child." "The term you use," said Mr. Brownlow sternly, "is a reproach to those long since passed beyond the feeble censures of the world. It reflects disgrace on no one living, except you who use it. Let that pass. He was born in this town." "In the workhouse of this town," was the sullen reply. "You have the story there." He pointed impatiently to the papers as he spoke. "I must have it here too," said Mr. Brownlow, looking round upon the listeners. "Listen then, you," returned Monks. "His father, being taken ill at Rome, was joined by his wife, my mother, from whom he had been long separated, who went from Paris and took me with her, and took after us properly, for what I know, for she had no great affection for him, nor he for her. He knew nothing of us, for his senses were gone, and he slumbered on till next day, when he died. Among the papers in his desk were two dated on the night his illness first came on, directed to yourself. He addressed himself to Mr. Brownlow, and enclosed in a few short lines to you, with an intimation on the cover of the package that it was not to be forwarded till after he was dead. One of these papers was a letter to this girl, Agnes, the other a will. What of the letter? Asked Mr. Brownlow. The letter? A sheet of paper crossed and crossed again with a penitent confession, and prayers to God to help her. He had pounded a tale on the girl that some secret mystery, to be explained one day, prevented his marrying her just then, and so she had gone on, trusting patiently to him, until she trusted too far, and lost what none could ever give her back. She was at that time within a few months of her confinement. He told her all that he meant to do to hide her shame if he had lived, and prayed her, if he died, not to curse his memory, or to think the consequences of their sin would be visited on her or their young child, for all the guilt was his. He reminded her of the day he had given her the little locket and the ring with her Christian name engraved upon it, and a blank left for that which he hoped one day to have bestowed upon her. Prayed her yet to keep it, and wear it next her heart, as she had done before, and then ran on wildly in the same words over and over again, as if he had gone distracted. I believe he had. The will, said Mr. Brownlow, as Oliver's tears fell fast. Monks was silent. The will, said Mr. Brownlow, speaking for him, was in the same spirit as the letter. He talked of miseries which his wife had brought upon him, of the rebellious disposition, vice, malice, and premature bad passions of you, his only son, who had been trained to hate him, and left you and your mother each an annuity of £800. The bulk of his property he divided into 2 equal portions, one for Agnes Fleming, and the other for their child, if he should be born alive and ever come of age. If it were a girl, it was to inherit the money unconditionally. If a boy, only on the stipulation that in his minority he should never have stained his name with any public act of dishonour, meanness, cowardice, or wrong. He did this, he said, to mark his confidence in the other, and his conviction, only strengthened by approaching death, that the child would share her gentle heart and noble nature. If he were disappointed in this expectation, then the money was to come to you. For then, and not till then, when both children were equal, would he recognise your prior claim upon his purse, who had none upon his heart, but had, from an infant, repulsed them with coldness and aversion. My mother, said Monks in a louder tone, did what a woman should have done. She burnt his will. The letter never reached its destination, but that and other proofs she kept, in case they ever tried to lie away the blot. The girl's father had the truth from her with every aggravation that her violent hate, I love her for it now, could add. Goaded by shame and dishonour, he fled with his children to a remote corner of Wales, changing his very name that his friends might never know of his retreat, and there, no great while afterwards, he was found dead in his bed. The girl had left her home, in secret, some weeks before. He had searched for her on foot in every town and village near. It was on the night when he returned home, assured that she had destroyed herself to hide her shame and his, that his old heart broke. There was a short silence here, until Mr. Brownlow took up the thread of the narrative. Years after this, he said, this man's, Edward Learford's, mother came to me. He had left her when only 18, robbed her of jewels and money, gambled, squandered, forged, and fled to London, where for 2 years he had associated with the lowest outcasts. She was sinking under a painful and incurable disease, and wished to recover him before she died. Inquiries were set on foot, and strict searches made. They were unavailing for a long time, but ultimately successful, and he went back with her to France. There she died, said Monks, after a lingering illness, and on her deathbed she bequeathed these secrets to me, together with her unquenchable and deadly hatred of all whom they involved, though she need not have left me that, for I had inherited it long before. She would not believe that the girl had destroyed herself and the child too, but was filled with the impression that a male child had been born and was alive. I swore to her, if ever it crossed my path, to hunt it down, never to let it rest, to pursue it with the bitterest and most unrelenting animosity, to vent upon it the hatred that I deeply felt, and to spit upon the empty vaunt of that insulting will by dragging it, if I could, to the very gallows foot. She was right. He came in my way at last. I began well, and but for babbling drabs, I would have finished as I began. As the villain folded his arms tight together, and muttered curses on himself in the impotence of baffled malice, Mr. Brownlow turned to the terrified group beside him, and explained that a Jew, who had been his old accomplice and confidant, had a large reward for keeping Oliver ensnared, of which some part was to be given up in the event of his being rescued, and that a dispute on this head had led to their visit to the country house for the purpose of identifying him. The locket and ring, said Mr. Brownlow, turning to Monks. I bought them from the man and woman I told you of, who stole them from the nurse, who stole them from the corpse, answered Monks without raising his eyes. You know what became of them. Mr. Brownlow merely nodded to Mr. Grimwig, who, disappearing with great alacrity, shortly returned, pushing in Mrs. Bumble and dragging her unwilling consort after him. Do my eyes deceive me? Cried Mr. Bumble with ill-feigned enthusiasm. Or is that little Oliver? Oh, Oliver, if you knew how I've been a-grieving for you. Hold your tongue, fool, murmured Mrs. Bumble. It's nature, Mrs. Bumble, remonstrated the workhouse master. Can't I be supposed to feel? I has brought him up parochially when I see him a sitting here among ladies and gentlemen of the very affablest description. I always loved that boy as if he'd been my, my own grandfather, said Mr. Bumble, halting for an appropriate comparison. Master Oliver, my dear, you remember the blessed gentleman in the white waistcoat? Ah, he went to heaven last week in an oak coffin with plated handles, Oliver. Come, sir, said Mr. Grimwig tartly, suppress your feelings. I will do my endeavours, sir, replied Mr. Bumble. How do you do, sir? I hope you are very well. This salutation was addressed to Mr. Brownlow, who had stepped up to within a short distance of the respectable couple. He inquired as he pointed to Monks. Do you know that person? No, replied Mrs. Bumble flatly. Perhaps you don't, said Mr. Brownlow, addressing her spouse. I never saw him in my life, said Mr. Bumble. Nor sold him anything, perhaps? No, replied Mrs. Bumble. You never had, perhaps, a certain gold locket and ring, said Mr. Brownlow. Certainly not, replied the matron. Why are we brought here to answer to such nonsense as this? Again Mr. Brownlow nodded to Mr. Grimwig, and again that gentleman limped away with extraordinary readiness. But not again did he return with a stout man and wife, for this time he led in two palsied women, who shook and tottered as they walked. You shut the door the night old Sally died, said the foremost one, raising her shrivelled hand. But you couldn't shut out the sound, nor stop the chinks. No, said the other, looking round her and wagging her toothless jaws. No. We heard her try to tell you what she'd done, and saw you take the paper from her hand, and watched you two next day to the pawnbroker's shop, said the first. Yes, added the second, and there was a locket and gold ring. We found that out and saw it given you. We were by. And we know more than that, resumed the first, for she told us often long ago that the young mother had told her that, feeling she would never get over it, she was on her way at the time that she was taken ill to die near the grave of the father of the child. Would you like to see the pawnbroker himself? Asked Mr. Grimwig with a motion towards the door. No, replied the woman. If he, she pointed to Monks, has been coward enough to confess, as I see he has, and you have sounded all these hags till you have found the right ones, I have nothing more to say. I did sell them, and they're where you'll never get them. What then? Nothing, replied Mr. Brownlow, except that it remains for us to take care that neither of you is employed in a situation of trust again. You may leave the room. I hope, said Mr. Bumble, looking about him with great ruefulness,